5 a.m. I'm up with a crisp Celsius energy drink. Running 12 miles today. Grab a green juice, quick change, and head to work. Meetings, workshops. One more Celsius, no slowing down. Working late, but obviously still meeting the girls for a little dancing. Celsius. Live, fit, go. Grab a cold, refreshing Celsius at your local retailer or locate now at Celsius.com.
Hello, welcome to Drilled. This is Amy Westerveld. I'm here today with a bit of an update to the history we chronicled in Season 3, where we looked at the last 100 or so years of fossil fuel propaganda. A new study from Harvard researchers Jeffrey Suprin and Naomi Oreskes highlights how ExxonMobil in particular has used language both to undermine climate action and to push the idea that it's an individual consumer problem, not anything to do with them or the systems they helped to create and continue to profit from. Lead researcher Jeffrey Suprin joined me to talk through the study's findings and what they mean for climate action more broadly, and what they might mean for the 24 or so climate cases making their way through the courts at the moment. That conversation coming up after this quick break.
PMS, pregnancy, menopause. Being a woman is a lot. Ollie supports you and yours with expert solutions for every age and life stage. They just launched 2 new products exclusively at Walmart. Period Hero combats bloat, mood swings, and more during PMS. And Balance Perimeno to support hormonal balance, mood, and metabolism during perimenopause. Grab yours at ollie.com. Ollie! These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
The #1 selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, onabotulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
So basically, if you run do some code to say what words appear, I think within plus or minus 5 words of the words climate change and global warming, there is literally no word or phrase that is more common than risk or risks. So it basically became their watchword throughout the 2000s. And likewise, in terms of the words that individualize responsibility, all the same keywords pop up regarding meeting the energy demand of consumers, meeting the needs, all these kinds of words.
Did you find that, the word risk was used to, in a way, to introduce doubt? Like, it's a risk, but it's not a certainty. Was it that kind of framing, or how is it being used?
Yeah, right. So essentially, they talk about climate risks, long-term risk, potential long-term risks, all permutations on the word risk. And our interpretation is that ExxonMobil used risk just as they have used other rhetorical cousins like uncertainty and more research and sound science, essentially the same intention of what's sometimes called strategic ambiguity.
Right.
It's exactly what the tobacco industry did, which is to shift the conversation from semantics, from concepts of reality to concepts of risk. And it's a very clever trick because you inject uncertainty into the narrative, into the discourse about climate change, while superficially not appearing to do so. So essentially, rather than correcting the record and acknowledging how they previously promoted doubt, they just changed the subject a little bit. A risk is something that may or may not happen. And by characterizing climate change as a risk, they implicitly implied that it was not a reality, even after clearly climate scientists had demonstrated that it was happening, that it is happening. And yeah, the thing that I think really gives us confidence in the use of this rhetorical tool is that it exactly mirrors the tobacco industry strategy. They did exactly the same thing, both for as a public relations tactics and also as a legal defense one.
That's interesting. So can you talk a little bit about that part, how you mapped this to what the tobacco industry was doing as well?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the way it first came up was running these so-called corpus comparison algorithms. So looking at, what terms appear over or underused in one set of documents compared to another. And this term risk and risks started jumping out very early to us. And I just happened to know that Robert Proctor, who's a tobacco historian, had written quite extensively about the use of risk as what he calls a legal having it both ways. So essentially, an admission strong enough to ward off accusations of failing to warn the public, but at the same time weak enough to kind of exculpate them from charges of having just marketed this deadly product. And it was that parallel that I noticed with the word risk that really started to encourage me to latch on to, what other parallels, what might we be seeing? And so it was in the process of looking at other terms and other discourses that are constructed that we started to realize they were also promoting this shift of responsibility away from the company and onto consumers by publicly fixating on consumer energy demand rather than the fossil fuels that the company supplies. And in that regard, too, I then came across another study from just a few years ago that really in detail laid out exactly how the tobacco industry had done this too. In the case of the tobacco industry, they played a two-pronged approach where in public, they used so-called demand as liberty. And in litigation, in defense against lawsuits, they flipped the script and basically talked about demand as blame. And what we've essentially found is ExxonMobil have done exactly the same thing in a slightly different way. The nuances are slightly different, but the overall pattern is the same, which is that demand is used in public to very subtly put the responsibility on the shoulders of the public.
Right.
And then when it comes to defending itself in court, the gloves will come off a little bit and they'll really double down on that demand as blame rhetoric. So this is really exciting. This is interesting to us because not only are the existing patterns evident, but it also, these insights allow us to begin to foresee how their defense against litigation and activism is going to expand in the coming years. So we're just starting to see the first early warning signs of that strategy, that blame game that they're playing.
That was actually like a big part of the decision in San Francisco.
Exactly.
When, Judge Alsup's ruling, like he kind of talked about that. It's like, well, sure, and that was very much the argument that was being made too, is that, hey, we're just fulfilling a demand. Without us, the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened. All of this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, so that's actually, we point this out in the paper that the reason Judge Alsup made that decision was very much, in response to the argument being made by Chevron's lawyer in defense of Exxon and other companies, where he very explicitly said it's not production that is causing greenhouse gas emissions. It's consumers, it's the demand, it's, quote, the way that people are living their lives. Yeah.
Correct.
And, of course, we're the first to acknowledge that demand is a legitimate part of the climate problem and its solution. But it's not the only part, and it's not actually the business focus of ExxonMobil, which is a supplier company.
Right.
So there's this very intriguing, and convenient. I came across a few years ago the fact that BP had first promoted the concept of a carbon footprint in 2004 to 2006. And so that, I think has really helped to kind of anecdotally demonstrate the role of the fossil fuel industry in promoting these individualized responsibility narratives. But what we think we're doing for the first time with this work is to actually systematically and empirically prove, in this case, ExxonMobil's role in encouraging and embodying those discourses. It's not to say, of course, that ExxonMobil has done this alone. It's been part of a a massive individualization effort by the fossil fuel industry seemingly writ large, and also just industries in general that promote. And it's so subtle. Like, Naomi and I analyzed these advertorials previously from, through the lens of analyzing explicit doubts and climate denial. And it basically escaped our notice that there was this systematic usage of terms and topics to shift responsibility away from the company. But for me, that's what makes it all the more important, because we're starting to be able to flag genuinely insidious and subtle propaganda that is shifting the way everyone thinks about this, whether they realize it or not.
It sort of like weaponizes American identity in a way too.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. We briefly touch on near the end of the paper how it's too massive of a separate thing to go into the details of how sociologically that sort of quote unquote rugged individualism has entrenched itself in American culture and ideology, but it really has. And so we briefly note that what it really seems like ExxonMobil did was to tap into that individualizing of society and risk that has been happening over the last few decades and really bring it to bear on climate change. So it's one piece of the puzzle, and we think it's an important one because it's the first definitive proof of these kinds of subtle strategies, which, by the way, I think you would enjoy. We include a quote in here from Herb Schmertz where, I don't know if you saw it, but where he specifically in his book says he calls the first guiding principle of the first guiding principle of public affairs is to quote unquote quote grab the good words and stick your opponents with the bad ones. And he talks and he specifically talks about the power of, I think he calls it semantic infiltration, whereby he says it's the process whereby language does the dirty work of politics. And that is exactly what we're seeing here.
That's really interesting. Well, because, I mean, I do, you see it all the time that like the industry really tries to position itself as like the only demand side only industry in the world.
Yeah. But then, that's right. It's the only problem and the only industry where the only solutions are demand side. There is nothing to be done on the supply side.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Framed in the context of anything else, it would sound ridiculous, right?
Yeah, it's totally ridiculous. And you see just how much bullshit it is when you look at what they did, in the 80s when there was no longer a sort of restricted supply problem, but Americans had gotten really good at energy efficiency. I found all these old Chevron shareholder magazines where they were really freaking out about the fact that, okay, we have more supply now, but demand is remaining flat because people have gotten so good at conserving energy. They were like, what are we going to do to get demand back up? And they artificially dropped prices. Whenever there's a glut of some kind, they fiddle with the pricing to drive demand.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, even if you look at what's happening with the natural gas glut and the plastic stuff, they've just found another market for it.
And also just more at the human scale that I think people can relate to. I mean, I've given many talks where some guy at the back has stood up and said I'm a hypocrite because my shoes contain, rubber or something. Right. And those accusations of hypocrisy leveled at climate academics and activists alike who criticize the fossil fuel industry. That's the ground level manifestation of this brainwashing, frankly.
Yes.
And so I think it kind of that's the really profound thing about this, that it manifests itself at all scales and all segments of society, whether it be the way scholars and scientists think about the kinds of problems they're asking, to the kind of stories journalists write, and it's only really like you and Emily and a few others who are kind of countering that now. And whether it be, the average Joe who, when you bring up climate change, the number one thing they think about is changing their light bulbs and stuff.
Right.
And,
that came up even with the crab fishermen that wound up suing the oil companies, even the ones, actually, that was an interesting case because a lot of them didn't and still don't believe that humans contribute to climate change. But their whole thing was that the companies had information that they were using to make their companies more resilient to climate change, and that they were keeping that information, and that it really doesn't matter what causes climate change, that they were they were covering it up. But even the ones who were more, like actually like, yes, think that climate change is real and that we need to do something about it and all of that kind of stuff, they were actually slower to join that suit because they were like, but I'm a hypocrite because I drive a big boat that burns diesel.
Wow.
Yes, it was crazy to me. I was like, wow, the people who are actual climate deniers are joining this suit, and the people who actually believe that we need to act on climate are the ones dragging their feet because this hypocrisy thing is so strong.
That's the thing, that if you're really focused on your own sense of guilt and responsibility, you become hamstrung from acting on what you know in order to hold the systemic failures to account that are locking us into this fossil fuel status quo society.
That's how powerful it is. So like, yes, it's subtle, but that you're totally right that I think that's what makes it so much more powerful. And especially because it like plays into all of these sort of societal structures too. It's like that much more effective.
Right. Well, exactly. That was and is the really clever thing about, now we found the strategies that both tobacco and fossil fuels are using, which is that they cannot be pointed to so clearly, so blatantly as, lying or falsehoods or anything like that, because they basically draw on common and often correct parlance, of journalists and academics and the public. It's just they're kind of spinning these words in a confusing way. But one other thing just to flag out of interest is that we actually also likewise find sets of distinctive terms that together communicate various other discourses of delay, as we call them. So, we find these systematic usages of terms that together, for example, constitute greenwashing, that constitute what we call fossil fuel solutionism, or that promote concepts of energy poverty and, things like that. And these all weave together, to construct this fossil fuel savior frame that we identify. But yeah, I thought I really felt like the risk and responsibility parts are the ones that haven't been kind of hammered, like people that hasn't quite been kind of encapsulated properly yet. So that's why we kind of focus on that.
I think that's super interesting. Well, I have this like long running obsession with the idea that like the sort of very entrenched personal responsibility narrative is sort of like at the root of every problem in the US.
Yeah.
Basically, we're constantly asking individuals to solve systemic problems just with their own, usually consumer choices.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that kills me too, is that individual action doesn't even get painted as political action or activism or whatever. It's 100% stuff you buy.
Right. Yeah. And we that's our concluding point in the paper, actually, that we quote another scholar who kind of wrote about this in a more anecdotal way back, like in 2001. He calls it the narrowing of our environmental imagination, to consumers first and citizens second, and that's our bottom line, really, that's what's happened here. And you're absolutely right. The other thing, just to flag with the hypocrite thing, is that someone called Jen Schneider, she wrote a book called Under Pressure, and we found that useful in doing this work, because that book, it's a group of rhetoricians, academics, looking at specifically coal industry rhetoric, and we draw on some of their terminology for naming these discourses that we identify. One of their terms that we don't actually use because we classify it under individualized responsibility, but I think is really great, is they talk about the hypocrite's trap. That's their name for that rhetoric of hypocrisy. I'm just mentioning that because I think that's quite a cool book, and one of the only ones I've seen that also takes the time to identify and name these things, because that's important, just developing this typology, just putting it out there.
Well, just making it clear that it's not like, I think there's this thing that happens where people think that it is some kind of natural evolution or like organically created, identity or whatever. And it's like, no, this was like really intentional.
This was engineered.
And engineered. And I think once people know that, then they can evaluate it in that context and form opinions that way, as opposed to just sort of
That's right.
buying
That's
the framing that they're handed. Yeah.
That's kind of what we want, what we hope people will take from this study.
That's it for today. Big thanks to Jeffrey Supran for joining us. You can find a link to the full study in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.